And welcome to the debate. Now, US President Donald Trump likes to say he's the protector of free speech, yet his administration has already threatened Democratic Congress members with investigation for criticising Conservatives while withdrawing federal grants that include language it opposes. This at its sanctioned law firms that represent Trump's political opponents, and arrested the Palestinian organiser of student protests that President Trump criticised as anti-Semitic, anti-American. And then over the weekend, this. The US president stripping back the government-funded news organisation Voice of America as he accused it of being anti-Trump and radical. So will free speech survive in America? And are we merely witnessing the opening salvos of a war on so-called wokeism? Now, with me tonight to discuss this, from New York, Jody Ginsberg, the CEO of Committee to Protect Journalists. Also here in the studio with me is Dr Marcel Laliberte, the Chief DEI Officer at HEC Paris, a leading business school here in France. As well, we've got Jérôme Viala-Godefroy, the author of Les mots de Trump, or as they say in English, the words of Trump, and Gerald Olivier, a Franco-American journalist. Thanks to all of you for coming in and for your time. But first of all, the Trump administration began mass layoffs at Voice of America and other US-funded media, making it clear its intent to gut outlets long seen as critical for US influence.
The United States Agency for Global Media, a set of publicly funded broadcasters aimed at an international audience, may have breathed its last. On Monday, the vast pool of Voice of America contractors were told to cease work immediately and that their contracts would officially end at the end of March. Press freedom reporter Liam Scott was among them.
The Trump administration's dismantling of VOA, RFE-RL, RFA and other outlets under US AGM are part of its efforts to dismantle the government more broadly. But it's also part of the administration's broader assault on press freedom and the media.
Other employees have been placed on administrative leave. Some of VOA's services have resorted to playing music as normal programming has been suspended. VOA was founded during World War II to counter Nazi propaganda.
This is a voice speaking from America.
A voice from America at war.
And now has bureaus all over the world, as well as a weekly audience of 360 million people across 49 different languages. Alongside its sister stations, it has become synonymous with pro-Western, pro-democratic media, designated undesirable foreign organisations by Moscow, who reacted to the announcement calling the various stations purely propagandistic. But EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, of Estonian nationality, lamented the Trump administration's decision, particularly regarding Radio Free Europe.
Coming from the other side of the Iron Curtain, actually, it was the radio that we got a lot of information what is actually going on. So it has been a beacon of democracy and very valuable in this regard.
When a Radio Free Europe journalist asked Kallas if the EU could fill the void left by Trump administration budget cuts, she answered not automatically, as numerous agencies are coming to the bloc with the same request.
Jody Ginsberg, coming to you in New York, is the Trump administration's efforts to shut down Voice of America part of a broader campaign to weaken the news media in the US?
Well, what we know from what the White House has said about this is it's certainly part of a broader attack on what the White House has called the radical left. On an article that was published on the White House homepage on Saturday, it called VOA the voice of radical America, and it gave some examples of the kinds of reporting that Voice of America has done, including running a segment about transgender migrants, and other kind of these broader DEI, alleged woke leftist type articles that it thinks is problematic more generally. So we know that's part of the reason why it has targeted VOA. It's part of this broad, although it said it's part of the campaign to reduce the size of the government, it looks like it's part of this broader campaign to tackle views that the government finds unsavoury.
Gerald, do you think the Voice of America is a radical left outfit?
Well, I'm sure there are some journalists in there who are. The point to look at, Judy was right about one thing. The main element is cutting federal spending. And VOA is not a single target. Trump is targeting very, very widely. VOA was founded in 1942 at the beginning of World War II. World War II has been over for over 80 years. It kept on going through the Cold War, and the EU High Commissioner on Foreign Issues was stressing how important that was for her when she was a child, to listen to that radio. The Cold War has been over for 30 years. You could question the purpose today of VOA. And definitely in some of its programming, you could see, I won't say anti-American, but definitely anti-Trump position, which is not very smart on the part of journalists who are being paid by the federal government. So Trump is not targeting it as a single issue. It's part of a wider intention to cut down federal spending. But if he can, at the same time, take advantage of that, yeah, he will. So that's what he's doing.
But isn't that viewpoint discrimination as opposed to promoting freedom of speech?
I don't think so, because there are today many other outlets that anyone can listen to besides VOA. We're no longer in an era where you get shortwave radios and you're lucky if you can catch one station. Most areas that have electricity have access to the internet, and you got thousands of sources that you can report to. VOA's purpose is not as clear-cut as it was 50 years ago.
Jerome, let me bring you in. First Amendment advocates say they've never seen freedom of speech under attack the way it's been in the last few weeks. How dangerous is all of this?
I think it's extremely dangerous. The attack, as it was said, is not just on VOA, it's on all the networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, and on their parent companies as well. And I a little bit disagree with the idea that VOA is only on the radio and it's kind of old-fashioned. It's used for pedagogical reasons. For instance, there's a lot of on the web. They do a lot of programming that's extremely interesting. And I think it's this attack on VOA is really is helpful for the autocrats and all the, it's something that they rejoice. In fact, Putin and Orban are extremely happy about these sort of things. And the model for Donald Trump is Viktor Orban, and that's something he said. I mean, it's in line with also what he said in his first term. He talked about the press as the enemy of the people. And the fake news, everything that is critical and that is factual is actually called fake news. It's like this Orwellian newspeak where the words mean the opposite of what they should. And so I find that extremely worrisome. It's attacks on, as you said, on the law, on lawyers, on the press generally, and something you see in the US right now is this fear, even coming from journalists. And I find that extremely scary. And yeah.
Marcel, you're not a journalist, obviously. You're a DEI officer at HEC. But I am interested how much of this sort of, debate, especially given in Trump's line of fire is DEI, which, of course, for those people who don't know, means diversity, equity and inclusion. How much of this is impacting campuses and companies on this side of the Atlantic?
A lot of questions are being raised because we're wondering when the wave will come over. As we've seen many movements in the US between Me Too, the Black Lives Movement, have all had some kind of form here in Europe. And so there are a lot of questions as to what is this going to take shape here. Right now, it's understanding what's going on in the US in terms of their legislation, the words that are used, the fear of litigation, which is what companies are dealing with in terms of anti-DEI sort of deprogramming in a sense, versus where the structure's here. And so it's almost like a wait and see, or like we'll push back and we'll hold on and we'll promote more diversity, equity and inclusion within our institutions.
Jody, a survey from the International Centre for Journalists reveals a disturbing level of tolerance for political bullying of the media in the US, especially among white male Republican voters. Does this mean we have failed as journalists to make the public understand the importance of what we do?
I think we have struggled to make people understand what journalists do and to make the case for journalism as the fundamental underpinning of democracy and civil liberties. And part of that is to do with the fact that journalists don't tend to like writing about themselves, and we need to do a better job of explaining the value that journalism has. And I fundamentally disagree that Though Voice of America was founded in 1942, it no longer has relevance. It reaches over 300 million people every week, including individuals who have very little independent media in their own countries, where that media is restricted. And as we heard from one of your other guests, the VOA closure effectively, I mean, we call it stripping back, but it's not broadcasting. Imagine if suddenly, France decided that it wanted to take all French-funded news broadcasts off the air tomorrow. That's exactly what's happened. VOA is not broadcasting. If you go on its websites, if you go on the shows, it's either broadcasting music or nothing at all. That's unbelievably chilling. And that's not about broadcasting information back into the United States. It's about broadcasting independent information. And that's really important. VOA is independent, as is RFE, of the government. There is no ability for the US government to dictate currently what those outlets say. And that's really important. There's a firewall between them. So now we have a situation in which many countries, like Russia, like Belarus, where there is effectively no independent journalism, do not have an outlet broadcasting back into those countries with the kind of independent information that their own countries want to restrict. And that should terrify us all.
Gerald, you want to say something?
Yeah. I was going to say regarding the cutting off of the voice of VOA as an attack on free speech. In France, and your viewers who follow French news may know or may not know, but a couple of weeks ago, a TV station was shut down. It was called C8. And it was controlled by a man named Bolloré, who has other TV stations that will tend to put forward more of a conservative, or even you might say right-wing point of view.
I would argue perhaps even sometimes even...
I didn't hear very much outcry as to the shutting down of a voice, since that voice was just not saying what everybody else is saying. And regarding what Judy was saying earlier, the idea that a entity funded by the government can be independent from government is an illusion. It is not. It can never be. You are who pays for what you do. And if it's not directly the person on top, it is the bureaucracy that surrounds it. So the idea was that VOA was not so independent as you might want it to be. There's still plenty of other outlets available for free speech.
Marcel.
I'm just curious also in terms of the parallel between academics and journalists. Because we've seen a rollback in the US in terms of public grants, funding to research, if they had certain words. Yet we count on our academics and our journalists to be able to bring forward some new ideas. So like the role of government in that sort of pursuit of innovation, because those are one of the goals that are sought by our democracies, is how we innovate, how we perform better, how we respond better to our sort of communities. And so that notion of like that argument too of pulling back the public grants for universities who are doing research in these spaces.
Jerome, I want to come back to the point I was asking Jody earlier. Is this not arrogance on our part? And it does sort of come off the back of what Gerald was saying, that as journalists and as academics, that we just assume people should appreciate what we do. And thus we become an easy target, if you like, for the likes of Donald Trump and other far-right leaders.
Yeah, and also the problem is that the regular press is already weakened by modern technology. And in fact, there's an interesting report by Media Matters that shows that the right actually dominates online media, the online media ecosystem. And especially with where they have the largest number of followers, you were talking about C8 in France, but C8 broke a lot of laws, and they were, and one of the reasons why they were put off the air is because they were breaking laws. So I don't think it's as ideological as you seem to.
That's exactly what the government said.
Yeah, but they did. It's a fact.
That's the government's message.
Well, yeah, but that's a factual thing. They broke the law, and they were, So I think that's another thing, and that's I think in this atmosphere of people following the news on other platforms. You look at even like the Washington Post. That's another good example. Bezos has totally changed his mind. The owner of the Washington Post has decided to really, impact the editorial content. And that's something he hadn't done in the last 10 years. And so it's changed completely. And a lot of journalists have left and a lot of subscribers have left because then there's no more editorial freedom. And that's a real scary perspective.
And at this point, Jodie, let me come back to you. How are mainstream legacy media outlets in the US dealing with this onslaught? Are they prepared to fight?
It's an interesting question. So you use the word onslaught, and that's actually what it's been like. It's really hard to describe to people who are not living through this what it is like to experience such a rapid unpicking of democratic norms. And that includes everything from the targeting of mainstream news outlets with legal threats, and not just at the federal level, not just by the Trump administration, but that runs all the way through society. So what we're seeing, and what we know to be true from our experience of other experiences of democratic decline, is that it starts at the top, the tone is set at the top, but then you see this all the way through. So you start to see state-level governments bring legal actions to try and silence journalism they don't like, police forces. It works all the way through. And what we're starting to see, unfortunately, is news outlets do what is termed anticipatory obedience, start to roll over, start to settle lawsuits so that they don't have to go through the whole legal rigmarole. We're starting to see journalists not wanting to have their bylines. We know, for example, that student journalists who are deeply concerned about what we're seeing on campuses, not wanting their bylines on student journalism because they're fearful, especially those who are not citizens, that they may now be deported. Even those who have green cards, which used to be considered somewhat of a guarantee that you could remain and exercise your right to free expression. Well, we've seen from the example of the Columbia student that that's no longer the case. So that fear creates self-censorship. And we know that to be true in places like Hungary, Hong Kong, that had reasonably flourishing media until very recently. When you start to see governments arrest journalists, go after media owners, the net result is that people start to self-censor.
Gerald, you may not agree with the people on this panel, but you surely appreciate that free speech allows us to have a variety of opinions around this table. So when you talk about, certain things being radical left or perhaps even the dreaded word wokeism, again, is that not viewpoint discrimination?
No, and the point is everybody's upset or denouncing some form of restriction on free speech. If you just try for 1 second to view the issue from the other side, the people who support Trump feel that their free speech has been denied and has been suppressed the past 5 years or more. 4 years ago, 5 now, or even less, during the 2020 campaign, anyone who claimed that the Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, anyone who claimed that he had a computer which he'd left behind that contained information was labeled a Russian asset, saw his Google account closed. A newspaper that printed that news back on October 14th, the New York Post, was taken down offline. I don't know what you call this, if not free speech restriction. So free speech is not being attacked right now. It has been attacked before, and all you're seeing is a form of counter-revolution.
Jerome, do you have any comments to that?
I mean, you listen to Fox News, they would use the Biden's, Hunter Biden laptop. They would talk about it all the time. I mean, they were not canceled, yes. Or, so it was, you see it on air, and it was in the, if you read the conservative media, yeah. you would still. But
you don't think that was an assault on free speech?
Well, I think not really. I think what I think is you do have the far extreme, the cancel culture, as it was called. I agree with you that on the left you also had extreme radicals for certain things, and again, the canceling culture is a form of censorship that I agree with.
51 former or current intelligence officer supporting or denying the existence of that laptop a few days before a presidential election, knowing that what they were saying was a lie, That was not an assault on democracy?
I don't think it's to the level, for sure, or the level that we see it now, and to the extent
I think it was much worse.
Oh, really? Well,
it altered an election. 17% of U.S. voters, 17% of U.S. electors said if they had known after the election what they have known before the election, what they learned after the election, they would have voted differently. That would have changed the outcome of the election.
We don't exactly know that. That may be, but
it's only a survey. Pretty striking.
So at this point, let me just bring in Jody, because obviously as the head of the Committee to Protect Journalists, I'd like you to answer to what Gerald was saying in those comments. I mean, in terms of, the fact that so many people were denied to hear about Trump's viewpoint in the 4 years of the Biden administration, would you agree that was the case?
I think describing this as some kind of counter revolution is entirely disingenuous. And what we are seeing now is fundamentally different to the experience of the previous 4 years or anything we've seen before. I don't disagree at all that previous presidents have tried to put restrictions around. For example, having Obama tried to restrict Fox News reporting from the White House, as we've seen. But we've never seen, for example, the Associated Press, one of the world's biggest news agencies, the news agency on which the majority of news outlets in the US rely, whether you are on the right or the left, being prevented from entering and reporting from the White House press pool. We have never seen this level of legal threat against news outlets from any president and from any administration. We have never seen this level of online harassment of journalists, particularly women and journalists of color, those from marginalized groups, forcing them to self-censor. So describing this as a kind of righting of wrongs, I think, is entirely disingenuous and frankly undermines the threat and devalues the threat that we are facing. A report that was published by the VDEM Institute last week showed that we have essentially given up all of the democratic gains globally over the last 40 years. More people now live in autocracies than live in democracies. And that should be worrying for all of us, whether you are on the right or on the left, because that threatens all of our liberties.
Marcel, Trump has called DEI a leftist indoctrination. Given the brutal nature of the language being used by Trump and his cohorts, are we also starting to witness self-censorship on the campus and, as Jody alluded there, anticipatory obedience as well?
I almost want to counter-argue in a sense that I think there's language shifts. Let's use the example of social media. Social media with Meta, they've shifted everything to community notes because in the spirit of democratic values, we'll let the community manage it. But what I think we don't measure in the US to be able to understand what's going on is the risk of litigation. Risk of litigation is expensive for companies, and the language, and I think this is part of the challenges that we've seen with the diversity, equity, and inclusion language is we've given preferential treatment to protected groups by the Civil Rights Act, and palpable benefits. And this is where the flaw, but also the counter-argument when we're defending diversity, equity, and inclusion is ensuring that equal treatment for all, which is not the case today.
Jerome, let's talk about how language shapes this cultural battle. I mean, Marcel just referred to it there. In your opinion, how does it do it?
Well, Trump is really good at that. He's a master of communication, and what he does is change the definition of words and repeats over and over the same thing. And it has really an effect. I mean, cognitive science has shown that repetition is an essential tool. And he has started really early, January 2017 already. As I said, he called the media, the press, the enemy of the people. He started by pointing specific groups, and then little by little, it was the entire press that was called the enemy of the people. He would, in his campaigns, he would also name specific journalists to the crowd that would be, and would even threaten them with violence. So really, the threat, I agree in that respect. That
we've got common ground here.
The threat of against the press has long happened. I mean, it's been almost 10 years now. it's interesting also the use, as you mentioned, of defamation suits, for instance. The point for Trump, like he goes after the Des Moines Register, for instance, the point is not to win. The point is really to break the Des Moines Register by, forcing them to, with legal fees, to basically go broke. And that's another issue. The money aspect is also something that is something to take into account.
Gerald, I mean, when we talk about the fact that certain press or media outlets come in the firing line as a result, and often what happens is online violence becomes real violence directed towards women journalists, and I would say, I'll put my hand up and say it's happened to me and other female journalists, along with people of colour. Do you not understand that there is a danger in this anger and hatred, which is now coming out of the White House and backed up by others towards the media? Is this what you want to see happen?
I think I disagree with, respectfully. It's much more dangerous to restrict speech at the same time as you restrict political access, because then you leave no other venue.
But isn't that
violence.
what Trump is doing, by doing it in reverse, by stripping back funding to the VOA and other US-funded outlets and targeting media outlets in the hope of making them bankrupt eventually?
Yeah, and if as far as the Des Moines Register is concerned, you have one specific issue at the heart of this litigation, is that this newspaper put out a poll 3 days before the election, giving Kamala Harris a 3-point lead coming up for the presidential election. On November 2nd, they gave that poll, giving her 3 points ahead. She lost by 14 points. And the question is, how genuine was that poll? Was it trying to reflect popular sentiment? Was it trying to influence popular sentiment? And so Trump said, you went after me, I'm going to go after you. And yeah, I'm president, so now I have more means than before. But the past 4 years, I wasn't president, and you've all come after me in New York and elsewhere for all kinds of reasons, very few being actually justified.
Jody, are we heading in the direction where we're going to see journalists from CNN, MSNBC or the New York Times being rounded up and sent to prison?
Possibly. I mean, first of all, I just want to correct a few things. So very few of them justified. Donald Trump has been taken to court and found guilty of at least 34 criminal charges. That's not made up by the press. That's not an invention.
It was made up by the judge and supported by the press.
Let Jody finish, please.
So this is how it works, right? You first of all go after the press and say they're not trustworthy. And then you start on the judiciary and say the judiciary is not trustworthy. This is how democracy dies. You go after each of the various elements that hold up democracy and say, well, they're not trustworthy. So you get rid of those until all you've got are yes men for the government. And that's exactly how it works. And so I don't think it's an exaggeration, Annette, to say we may well see US journalists in prison. I mean, I don't think anyone 2 weeks ago would have thought that US green card holders could be deported for exercising their First Amendment rights to speak freely. I think very few people would have said, though it was expected that the Trump administration would come after Voice of America, that it would be gutted and essentially kicked off air within 24 hours. Very few people were expecting the level of devastation that has resulted from the US AID cuts, which have effectively withdrawn support from hundreds of independent news outlets across the world, again, that were providing information to and about citizens of countries where their own governments seek to restrict information from them. And that's deeply disturbing. So I think absolutely, I've just been reading Sinclair Lewis's book, It Can't Happen Here, written in 1935, that envisages exactly this scenario of a US autocracy where we start to see US citizens being arrested for expressing themselves freely. And I don't think I think we need to be very clear about what is happening here. It's easy to think, well, we all have democracies. Nothing like that can possibly happen here. It happens very fast. You speak to our colleagues in Hungary, our colleagues in Brazil. It happens very, very fast. And then you suddenly find that you have very few allies coming to your aid.
Jerome, over the weekend, a federal judge on Sunday the Trump administration asked the Trump administration to respond to allegations that US immigration enforcement willfully disobeyed an order halting the deportation of a Rhode Island doctor who is a Lebanese citizen and who was in the US legally. Given what we're hearing from Jody and from other sources as well, are we seeing the US head towards a constitutional crisis?
Yeah, I think it's very possible. And what you see is the rhetoric going, in that direction. You see the DOJ basically saying that, going after judges and after the judge's decision, you hear people in Congress talking about impeaching the judge. And so this is, and even some of the things that DOJ has done by, gutting the different departments, it's not very clear whether they've abided by the law, by the decisions of the court. So things are extremely unclear. And I think little by little you see this, and you've seen it with Trump for many years, but you see it with his allies today. That they question and they attack judges and the courts. And so it's not unlikely, it's not impossible anymore to think that he might just tell even the Supreme Court they can do whatever they want. We disagree, and it's all political.
Gerald, is this pushback just an inevitable result of so-called wokeism? Was it going to have to happen because, in your opinion, things have gone way too in the opposite direction?
It's not just my opinion. I think it's
but we want to hear everybody's opinion.
Of a majority of Americans, 77 point something million, who voted for Trump. And one of the issues of the campaign were actually some aspects of wokeism. Transgender issue, especially when it comes to allowing men, even though they may consider themselves not to be men anymore, but biological men to compete in women's sport, especially at high school or university level. That was an issue on which Americans voted, and they voted overwhelmingly against that idea of allowing biological male into women's sport because it's unfair to women. And doing it in the name of feminism and promoting women's issue was kind of turning the world upside down. And what I've been trying to say tonight is that you need to look at things from the other side. Once again, if anything is happening, it's much more of a counter-revolution. You're complaining about the disappearance of free speech. There was an investigation or a survey which was done in the month that followed Kamala Harris taking over from Joe Biden for the Democratic nomination for president. And it showed that 84% of media coverage, print, TV, online, was favorable, 84%. The result of the election was 50-50, more or less. So was that a fair representation of the electorate at large? No. I think a certain segment of the population today have to realize that they've been confiscating free speech and that it's time to listen to the other side.
Marcel, what are you hearing from young people on campuses here in France? Are they worried about these issues? Do they see what's going on?
They're worried about the issues in the US, which encourages or sort of motivates them to do more here. And especially when we explain sort of the different contexts, because it really, again, I come back to the context, and I would almost counter-argue also, the elections are always about the economy in the US.
Yeah.
And the transgender topic is minimal. I mean, we know at the NCAA, for example, we were talking about 40 athletes.
Trump would mention it in his speech.
Of course.
There was always a couple of sentences.
Every time we look at it, when we peel back the executive orders, it's very small percentages. Transgender in the military, the amount spent on transgender care versus erectile dysfunction is astronomical. It's like 5 million to 81 million. I mean, it's a small issue, and if we're going to spend a lot of time on that, it takes away from the larger issue, which was the economy for the elections in the US. But coming back to the students on campus, this is where we try to ensure the diverse perspectives, because it's not holding one side of the discussion, it's having both sides, and developing the critical thinking to look in the detail. Go read the executive orders and see what's being written word for word in those orders.
Jody, where are the Democrats in all of this?
I wish I knew. I wish I knew. You asked the question, is there a constitutional crisis? I would argue it's already here. Much of the money that is being frozen is what's called constitutionally appropriated. That means that Congress has already, congressionally appropriated, which means Congress has already voted for that money to be spent. And therefore, legally, it should go out the door and be spent as Congress has approved it. And what we've seen with these executive orders is a freezing of that. Then judges saying, actually, no, you're not allowed to do that. It's illegal. Go back and spend the money. But of course, the damage has already been done at that point. So we're seeing very little pushback from Congress or from Democrats. And I think part of the reason for that is the speed of change. You have seen so many executive orders go out the gate. You have seen so much activity and movement on the economy, tariffs one day, no tariffs the next day, then some more tariffs the next day. It's very hard for people to know where to focus their energies, going after DEI, going after universities, going after certain news organizations. That's part of the tactic, but it's also part of the challenge for those who would like to push back, is knowing where and how to do that effectively. And it's why the courts and the sanctity of the courts remains so important. And we know from our experience at CPJ of countries elsewhere that where it is possible to push back, that often comes from the strength of the judiciary and the legal system.
Yes, sorry. Gerald, yes.
Just wanted to concur on part of what Judy was saying. And it also will answer your question from a couple of minutes ago, whether we were going into a constitutional crisis. I do not think so at all. And I think that, on the contrary, the institutions are fulfilling their role. Judy is perfectly right. There's tons of executive orders out there, and Trump is going very, very fast and trying to go through everything. But what we find that little by little, a judge will block such an EO executive order. Congress will say, you don't have the power to do this. The institutions are taking their part. Regarding the, the deportation of that Algerian student, Mahmoud Khalil, out of Colombia, not because of free speech issues, but for security issues. The order was blocked by a judge. And the White House, through DOJ, asked for a higher appeals court to stay that judgment so they can carry on with their work. So the institutions are fulfilling their role. That's not what I call a crisis.
Well, you saw it again with the Venezuelans that were thrown out in the name of terrorism this weekend, but they didn't comply with the judge's decision to return them, even when they were on air, when they were on planes. So
now we've got just a few minutes left, and I want to ask you all an important question, because these are very meaty subjects we've been discussing this evening. First of all, Jody, and then all of you can respond, and I'm literally going to have to keep it very brief. Jody, where do you see America 5 years from now?
I think that it's very possible that we can have a third-term Donald Trump, unless all of the institutions start acting in kind of with the urgency that this moment demands. I think it's very, very possible.
Gerald.
First of all, no chance, zero chance of Trump still being president 5 years from now. Okay, I'm willing to come back, being tarred and feathered if I'm wrong. Okay, I'm willing to.
We'll hold you to that.
We'll hold me to that. No, I see a vibrant country. I see a very vibrant country, economically speaking. Free speech issues. There is a lot of optimism in the United States. Trust me. Maybe not in New York and among very far left and liberal circles, but everywhere else there is. And I'm very positive as for the future.
Jerome.
I think they're trying to blow up the system, the entire system. I think that's the point. Chaos is the point. And I think only when it gets to the economy and it gets real for people, then we'll see a reaction, a counter reaction from the grassroots. And I think that's what will save the US from, autocracy. But I think it's a dangerous time, and I think anything is possible right now. And information is at the center. And just one last thing, you look at the other side of the media that the White House wants to use. You have OAN, you have Breitbart News, the New York Post.
With them?
They have, it's all
they disagree
fake.
with you.
It's conspiracy theories. It's fake news. And it's very easy.
We went over that.
It's very easy.
And
Okay,
proved it wrong.
Marcel, where do you see the US 5
For
years from
me,
now?
hearing this conversation and sort of reading what's going on, it's cultural identity in question. Because I think we don't measure the state-by-state sort of identity that a lot of the states have and the impact on its overall governing structure as a United States. This is where I question what we'll see in 5 years is that cultural identity and what will be the value system of the US, either an economic sort of pushback or implosion from within, but this is sort of the questions I have in terms of identity.
Are there American students at HEC?
Yes.
And what's their feeling about it?
We haven't had conversations in depth with our American students.
Okay, well, at this point, I'm going to have to wrap it up there. I want to thank all of my guests. That's Jodie Ginsberg, Gerald, Jerome and Marcel. Thank you very much. You've been watching the France 24 debate. You, of course, can find it online. It will be posted shortly. So I'll be back tomorrow. So until then, do stay on France 24.